It's a story that starts with a phone call but ends with an unexpected twist. Imagine this: a white neighbor, alarmed by what he perceives as suspicious activity, calls the police on his black neighbors. What he doesn't know, though, is that the black man he's accusing is a prosecutor with years of experience in the justice system. When the police arrive, the situation takes an entirely different turn, challenging assumptions and shedding light on deeper issues of race and perception. In moments like these, the line between what we think we know and what's actually true becomes blurred. What happens next will make you question how assumptions can shape our interactions, and why sometimes things are not always as they appear. But here's the catch: as tensions rise, the truth is about to unfold in the most unexpected way. Stay tuned because the real story is just beginning. The day had started like any other for Marcus. A quiet Saturday afternoon, a little yard work, a few laughs with his wife. He had no idea that across the street, a neighbor, someone he had barely spoken to in passing, was watching him through a window, growing more suspicious by the minute. To Jim, the sight of Marcus moving about his own property didn't feel quite right. Was it the unfamiliar car parked in the driveway? The way Marcus was walking, the brief exchange with his wife? Whatever it was, Jim's gut told him something was off. He picked up the phone and dialed 911. Meanwhile, Marcus was just doing his thing, unaware that his ordinary day was about to take a sharp turn. When the police pulled up, it wasn't just the confusion of the moment that hit him. It was the realization that this wasn't a simple case of a concerned citizen. Something deeper was at play here. But what? As the police car came to a halt, Marcus' first thought was that it was some sort of misunderstanding. Maybe his neighbor was just concerned about the noise. But when the officers approached, there was a sharp, almost defensive edge in their tone. "We received a call about a disturbance," one of them said. Marcus could feel the subtle shift in the air, the shift from friendly curiosity to something more pointed. He calmly explained that he was just doing some light work around the house, but the officers weren't convinced. Their eyes flickered toward the front door, almost as if they were waiting for something. Was it the color of his skin? The uncertainty hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. He could sense they were on edge, not sure if he was a threat, or if they were being set up for something. Jim, standing behind his curtains, watched it all unfold with growing tension. What had he done? Was this going too far? He told himself he was just being cautious, but now, seeing the police interacting with Marcus, he felt a knot in his stomach. Was it racism? Was it just a genuine mistake? He tried to shake the feeling but couldn't. The silence in his house was deafening, and his own guilt began to eat at him. Marcus tried to stay composed, but the frustration was building. He had spent years working as a prosecutor, fighting for justice, but now, in the face of this misunderstanding, he felt powerless. What could he say that would change Jim's perception of him, or of his entire community? It was a sobering realization, how easily people could judge, how quickly things could escalate. The officers didn't leave, and Marcus knew something wasn't right. He glanced at his wife, who stood in the doorway, eyes wide with worry. What would happen if they didn't believe him? What if this moment was bigger than just a simple misunderstanding? The air was thick with tension, and the only thing that was clear was that nothing was going to be resolved today, not without revealing some uncomfortable truths. The minutes stretched like hours as Marcus stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and though he tried to keep his voice steady, he knew the officers weren't buying his explanation. The situation was spiraling, and it wasn't just the police he had to convince. It was Jim, his neighbor across the street, who still hadn't come outside to clarify the misunderstanding. One of the officers stepped back, speaking quietly into his radio. but the tension between them was undeniable. It wasn't just about a simple disturbance call anymore. The deeper Marcus tried to explain, the more the officers seemed unsure. Was he guilty of something? Did they have the wrong man? Their eyes were scanning his movements, their stance becoming more rigid by the second. From behind the curtains, Jim stood frozen, guilt surging through him. He couldn't take his eyes off the scene unfolding in front of him. He had started this. He was the one who called the police. But now, with every moment that passed, the heaviness of his actions began to settle in. His mind raced, trying to justify what he had done. Was this really about safety, or was it about something else? Something deeper, harder to admit. Marcus' wife, standing nervously at the door, looked from her husband to the officers. She could sense the shift in energy. This wasn't just a confrontation over a simple misunderstanding. It was something more. The longer they stood there, the more she feared for her husband's safety. They had lived in this neighborhood for years, but suddenly it didn't feel so familiar. It didn't feel safe. As the officers exchanged brief words, one of them moved toward the front of the house, his hand resting on his radio as though preparing for something more. Marcus got twisted. He knew where this was headed. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, was on the line in this one crucial moment. His voice was calm, but inside he was fighting the urge to shout, to demand that they see him as who he truly was, a professional, a man who upheld the law every day. Then, just as the situation reached its breaking point, something shifted in Jim. He couldn't stay silent anymore. He had to come out. He had to speak up. But what could he say that would undo what had already been set in motion? Could he even fix this? The tension was unbearable. With every second that passed, the possibility of something irreversible happening grew. Marcus' eyes briefly met his wife's, and in that silent exchange, he knew that the next few moments would change everything. Just as Jim stepped out of his house, heart pounding, he didn't realize that the entire neighborhood had already begun to take notice. Windows were opening, people were watching, whispering. The tension had become palpable, and now, in front of everyone, Jim was about to confront the very situation he had started. His mind raced, torn between wanting to apologize and the fear of what it might mean. What if his words only made things worse? Marcus' eyes locked on Jim's figure, standing awkwardly at the edge of his driveway. For a moment, it seemed like the world had stopped. Everything hung in the balance, as if they were all waiting for the next move. Jim took a deep breath and slowly walked toward Marcus. But his hesitation was obvious, his steps uncertain. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the tension snapped. A new police car, sirens blaring, pulled up sharply to the curb, adding a layer of chaos to the already fragile situation. This wasn't just a routine response now, it was escalating. The officers exchanged glances, and Marcus' heart skipped a beat. Was this another unit? Had the situation turned from a simple misunderstanding to something worse? The officer's demeanor shifted instantly. One of them, a younger cop with sharp eyes, stepped forward, speaking quickly into his radio. "We've got backup. Keep your eyes peeled." What backup? Marcus couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. Why would they need more officers for something so trivial? But it was the look in their eyes, sharp, calculating, that made him realize something bigger was unfolding. Jim's face turned pale as the second car arrived, and suddenly the entire neighborhood seemed like a pressure cooker about to blow. What was happening? Had he unknowingly dragged Marcus into something far deeper than he could have imagined? Marcus couldn't take it anymore. He turned to the officers. "What is going on here? What's the real reason you're here?" His voice had lost its calm, rising with frustration and confusion. The younger officer paused, glancing over his shoulder at his colleague, but said nothing, keeping his eyes locked on Marcus. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the unexpected happened. The second police officer, the one who had been standing quietly at the edge of the group, suddenly stepped forward, lifting his radio, and spoke into it with a sharp urgency. "This isn't him. We've got the wrong person." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The realization hit hard. Marcus wasn't the man they were looking for. But who was? The realization crashed over Marcus like a wave. He wasn't the person they were looking for. His body froze, the anger and confusion melting into disbelief. But the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it deepened. The officers' expressions were unreadable, but there was a new, sharp intensity in their eyes. "Who are you looking for, then?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaky but firm. The realization hit hard. Marcus wasn't the man they were looking for. But who was? The realization crashed over Marcus like a wave. He wasn't the person they were looking for. His body froze, the anger and confusion melting into disbelief. But the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it deepened. The officers' expressions were unreadable, but there was a new, sharp intensity in their eyes. "Who are you looking for, then?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaky but firm. The younger officer glanced over at his partner, his fingers twitching at the radio as if unsure how much to reveal. It's a misunderstanding," he said, his voice oddly distant. But it didn't feel like a misunderstanding anymore. It felt like a cover-up. The silence stretched between them, a moment of realization hanging in the air. Marcus wasn't just dealing with a careless mistake. Something else was at play. Then, without warning, a third police car arrived, pulling up with sudden urgency. Two officers stepped out, and at that moment, something clicked in Marcus' mind. This wasn't about neighborhood disturbance calls. This was something much more serious. They weren't just responding to a suspicious situation. They were looking for someone connected to a much larger case. He could feel the change in the air, like the moment before a storm. Suddenly, everything came rushing into focus. The officers weren't just trying to resolve a simple misunderstanding. Jim's call had triggered a much deeper investigation, one that had been quietly unfolding in the background. And it wasn't just the black man who had caught their attention. Marcus realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had become a pawn in something far more complicated. The twist hit him hard. It wasn't just a neighborly mistake. The officers had been investigating a series of financial fraud cases, and they had been tracking someone who fit Marcus' description. A moment of chilling clarity washed over him. Jim's innocent call had triggered a series of events that could have destroyed his career, and worse, his life. Just as Marcus was about to speak, the third officer, the one who had been silent until now, turned to the others with a look of realization. "Wait a minute. This is the guy. This is our guy." For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Marcus' stomach dropped, and Jim stood frozen on his driveway, eyes wide with confusion. What was happening? Was this still a mistake, or had everything shifted into something darker? And then the final twist. The officer who had spoken up wasn't talking about Marcus at all. He was talking about Jim. Jim's face drained of color as he looked from the officer to Marcus, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. But there were no words. The officer continued, voice tight with a mixture of disbelief and recognition. "We've been tracking a suspect for weeks now. A local resident involved in the scam. Turns out, Jim here was one of the key players." It was like the ground had been ripped out from under Marcus' feet. The true culprit had been standing there the whole time, completely unaware that his own actions had set everything into motion. Marcus stood there, stunned. Jim, the neighbor who had called the police on him, was now the focus of a much larger investigation. The weight of everything that had happened crashed down on him all at once. The racial assumptions, the police presence, the false accusations, all leading to this one shocking revelation. The officers moved in, surrounding Jim, as his world fell apart in an instant. The final twist left Marcus with a bitter taste. The danger wasn't just in the assumption. It was in the layers of deception that could be hiding in plain sight, right next door. And for a moment, as he watched Jim being taken away, Marcus couldn't help but wonder, how often do we get the wrong person? How often do we judge someone based on what we think we know? As the police led Jim away, the weight of the moment began to settle on Marcus. His heart was still racing, but the anger that had once burned inside him slowly faded, replaced by something more complex. He had been accused, judged, and nearly swept into something he had no part of, simply because of who he was. Yet in that moment, watching Jim's world collapse, Marcus couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The officers wrapped up their investigation, clearing Marcus' name and offering a brief apology, but the damage was done. In just a few hours, the assumptions, the fears, and the biases of an entire neighborhood had been exposed. It was a painful reminder of how easily we misjudge others, how a single call could change the course of someone's life forever.